The Galactic Military Academy hung suspended in the void like a titanium cathedral, its sprawling corridors and training bays housing the universe's most elite warriors. Unlike the sterile space stations of fiction, this was a living organism, of metal and energy, where the constant hum of life support systems mixed with the thunder of combat training. The walls bore scorch marks from decades of alien weaponry, and the air recyclers worked overtime to filter out the pheromones of fear that seemed permanently embedded in the ventilation duct in the mess hall. Conversations died like candles in a hurricane whenever Vextar 13 entered. The draconian berserker stood 9 feet tall, his obsidian scales reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights like a living shadow. His eyes burned with the gold of dying stars, and each footstep sent vibrations through the reinforced deck plating. The other cadets Valorians with their honor scars, cybernetic nexus units with their glowing implants, even the stoic Zentari warriors instinctively moved away from him like debris fleeing a black hole. 13 had earned his reputation through blood and terror. 47 consecutive victories in combat trials had made him a legend whispered about in dormitories across 40 systems. 3 entire species had filed formal complaints about his excessive intimidation tactics during joint training exercises. Even the instructors, battle-hardened veterans who had seen the worst the galaxy could offer, spoke about him in hushed tones, their voices carrying the weight of barely contained unease. The mess hall stretched before him like a sea of averted eyes and nervous silence. Tables that had been buzzing with conversation moments before hosted only the sound of nervous breathing and the scrape of chairs as cadets subtly shifted away. This was his domain, his kingdom of fear, and he ruled it absolutely. The darkness inside him fed on their terror, growing stronger with each trembling salute and hastily cleared pathway. He moved through the maze of tables like a predator through tall grass, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to swallow light itself. The serving drones, programmed to be emotionless, somehow managed to display what could only be described as mechanical anxiety as they prepared his meal. Even the artificial intelligences feared him. Vextar 13 selected his usual table isolated in the corner, with clear sight lines to all entrances and exits. It was a strategic position, one that allowed him to observe potential threats while within, ensuring no one could approach him undetected. He sat alone, always alone, the empty chairs around him forming a barrier as effective as any force field. The meal before him was standard academy fare: protein cubes, nutrient paste, and synthesized vegetables that bore only a passing resemblance to anything that had ever grown on a planet. But it wasn't the food that sustained him. It was the fear radiating from every corner of the hall, the delicious terror that reminded him of his power, his dominance, his absolute superiority over these lesser beings. As he ate, Vextar 13 allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opponents to break, new reasons for the galaxy to fear his name. The Academy had tried to civilize him, to channel his aggression into something resembling discipline, but they had only succeeded in creating a more efficient monster. He was death incarnate, and everyone knew it. The mess hall remained quiet. The only sounds the distant hum of the station's engines and the careful movements of cadets who dared not disturb the apex predator in their midst. Asterisk, the silence in the mess hall was absolute, a living thing that pressed against the walls like a held breath. Vextar 13 savored it, the way a wine connoisseur might appreciate a particularly fine vintage. This was power in its purest form, not the crude brutality of fang and claw, but the refined terror that came from reputation alone. The Academy's best and brightest, warriors who had conquered worlds and tamed star systems, all reduced to nervous children in his presence. Then the doors slid open with their characteristic pneumatic hiss, and everything changed. She was small impossibly. ridiculously small by Academy standards. Standing barely 5 feet 2 inches, Emma Chun looked like a child who had wandered into a convention of giants. Her uniform was regulation, but somehow seemed different on her slight frame, as if the fabric itself had been domesticated. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her eyes held the kind of calm that came from either profound wisdom or complete ignorance of danger. But it wasn't the human that made the mess. Hall's collective breath catch in their throats. It was the small, soft-sided carrier she held in her hands, and the distinctly non-regulation sounds emanating from within. Emma glanced around the hall with the casualness of someone choosing a seat at a coffee shop rather than navigating a minefield of interstellar tensions. Her gaze swept over the Valorian warriors with their ritual combat scars, past the gleaming chrome of the Nexus units, beyond the stern faces of the Xanthari military elite. She seemed utterly unbothered by the waves of barely contained aggression that filled the air like radiation. The entire Academy held its breath as she made her choice. There, in the corner where shadows gathered like hungry ghosts, sat the one being every sentient creature in the galaxy had learned to fear. Vextar 13 occupied his corner table like a dark star, his presence warping the very fabric of social interaction around him. The empty chairs surrounding him told a story of isolation that had been years in the making. Emma walked directly toward him. The soft padding of her boots on the metal deck seemed to echo louder than the thunder of combat. Training. Each step she took was a violation of every survival instinct evolution had ever gifted to intelligent life. The other cadets watched in horrified fascination, like witnesses to an impending stellar collision. Without hesitation, without even a glance at the massive draconian, whose golden eyes tracked her movement with predatory precision, Emma pulled out the chair directly across from Vextar 13 and sat down. The sound of the chair scraping against the floor was like a gunshot in the silence. "Hope you don't mind sharing," she said, her voice carrying the easy familiarity of someone addressing an old friend. "Everywhere else seems pretty crowded." The carrier in her hands gave a small, inquiring trill, a sound that belonged to green meadows and sunny windowsills, not the cold corridors of a military academy. Emma smiled and began working the clasps, her fingers moving with practiced ease. Vex **13 stared at her, his massive frame frozen in what might have been shock or might have been the moment before he struck. His clawed hands, capable of rending steel, gripped the edges of the table with enough force to leave permanent indentations. The air around him seemed to shimmer with barely contained violence. "Let me introduce you to someone special," Emma continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that she was sitting across from the most dangerous being in known space. The carrier opened with a soft click, and out stepped a small orange tabby cat. The silence that followed was so complete that the station's life support systems seemed to pause in respect. Here, in the heart of the galaxy's premier military institution, surrounded by the deadliest warriors of a dozen species, a house cat from Earth began to groom itself with the casual indifference of royalty. *Muffin, for that was the cat's name. Though no one in the mess hall knew it, he had completed his grooming with the methodical precision of a being who had never encountered anything worth worrying about. His orange fur caught the harsh fluorescent lights and transformed them into something warm and golden. He was small, soft, and utterly alien in an environment designed for warriors and weapons. The cat's green eyes surveyed his new surroundings with the calm assessment of a general reviewing his troops. He noted the Valorian warriors with their ritual scars, dismissed the chrome-plated Nexus units as unworthy of attention, and completely ignored the stern disapproval radiating from the Xanthari military elite. His gaze moved past them all, past the empty tables and abandoned conversations, until it found the one being in the hall who commanded genuine respect. Vextar 13 sat like a mountain of controlled violence, his obsidian scales gleaming within inner fire that spoke of battles won and enemies broken. His golden eyes, which had stared down the most fearsome warriors in the galaxy without flinching, now held something that might have been confusion. This small, insignificant creature was looking at him, not with fear, not with the desperate respect he had grown accustomed to, but with what could only be described as polite interest. Muffin stood up from his casual position and began to walk, not away from the apex predator who had made strong beings weep, but directly toward him. Each step was placed with feline confidence, as if the concept of danger was a foreign language he had never bothered to learn. The Academy's most feared warrior found himself frozen, not by terror or rage, but by sheer impossibility. In his long and violent existence, Vex-Star 13 had faced down star cruisers, stood toe-to-toe with cybernetic battle titans, and emerged victorious from conflicts that had left entire systems uninhabitable. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the sight of a small Earth cat approaching him with the casual confidence of a diplomat arriving for tea. Asterisk. Muffin reached the edge of the table and paused, his head tilted at an angle that somehow conveyed both curiosity and mild approval. The cat's purr began as a small rumble, barely audible above the hum of the station's life support systems, but it grew steadily stronger. It was a sound that belonged to hearth and home, to lazy afternoons and gentle hands concepts that had no place in the sterile corridors of the Academy. Then, with the fearlessness that only true innocence can provide, Muffin reached up and gently headbutted Vex-Star 13's massive clawed hand. The contact lasted only a moment, but it might as well have been a supernova. The most dangerous being in the galaxy stared down at the small orange head pressed against his scales. And for the first time in his violent existence, Vex-Star 13 felt something other than rage or hunger. It was warm and strange and utterly incomprehensible. Muffin, apparently satisfied with this initial contact, began to rub against the Draconian's hand with the enthusiasm of someone greeting a long-lost friend. The purring grew louder, filling the silence with a sound that predated starships and stellar empires. That spoke of a time when the universe was young and all creatures knew their place in a gentle hierarchy of companionship. "He likes you," Emma said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. Muffin's usually pretty good about reading people. The entire mess hall held its breath as Vex-Star 13's hand, the same hand that had crushed opponents and shattered armor, began to move. Slowly, carefully, with a gentleness that seemed to violate the laws of physics, he began to pet the cat. His massive claws, each one capable of rending steel, moved through the soft orange fur with the delicacy of a surgeon. Muffin's purr became a small engine of contentment, and he settled himself more comfortably against the Draconian's hand. The sight was so fundamentally impossible that several cadets began to wonder if they were experiencing a collective hallucination. Asterisk companion animals are a pretty common thing on Earth, Emma explained, her tone conversational as she unpacked her regulation meal. Around them, the mess hall remained frozen in a tableau of disbelief, but she seemed completely unbothered by the attention. "We figured out a long time ago that having someone to care for makes us better at caring for each other." Vex-Star 13 listened to her words, but his attention was focused entirely on the small creature that had claimed his lap with the confidence of a conqueror. Muffin had settled himself into a perfect circle, his purr creating vibrations that seemed to resonate through the Draconian's massive frame. The sensation was entirely foreign, warm, gentle, and completely without agenda. The cat didn't want anything from him except his presence, didn't fear him or seek to use him or challenge him. It was the first relationship in his life that existed, purely for its own sake. "You're Cadet 13, right?" Emma asked, taking a bite of her protein cube with the same casual ease she'd shown when sitting at his table. "I read about your combat record. Pretty impressive stuff." The warrior who had never met an opponent he couldn't break found himself unable to form words. His reputation, his legend, his identity, all of it seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the small weight in his lap and the steady rhythm of contentment that vibrated through his being. "I'm Emma, by the way. Emma Chun. Just transferred in from the Earth Defense Academy." She gestured toward the cat, who had begun to knead gently against Vexstar 13's armored leg. "And that's Muffin. He's my partner." "Partner?" The word emerged as a rumble from deep in Vexstar 13's chest. The first sound he had made since the impossible encounter began. "Earth developed a pretty unique approach to military training," Emma explained, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "We discovered that the strongest warriors aren't the ones who can destroy everything. They're the ones who can choose not to. The ones who have something worth protecting." She paused to take another bite, completely unbothered by the fact that she was having a casual conversation with the Academy's most feared legend. "That's what companion animals teach us. They show us that real strength isn't about domination. It's about gentleness. About using your power to protect something smaller and more vulnerable than yourself." The words hit Vexstar 13 like a physical blow. He had built his entire existence around the concept of strength through fear, of power, through dominance. But here was this small human, sitting calmly in his presence, suggesting that everything he had believed about strength was wrong. Muffin stirred in his lap, stretching with the languid ease of someone completely secure in their safety. The cat's green eyes opened briefly, fixed on Vexstar 13's golden ones, and seemed to convey a message that transcended language. "You are safe. You are trusted. You are worthy of love. The Academy brought me here as a specialist in what they call aggressive pacification," Emma continued. "Basically, I help warriors who've forgotten that the point of being strong isn't to make others weak, it's to make them feel safe." She reached across the table, and with the same casual fearlessness she had shown from the beginning, briefly touched Vexstar 13's free hand. The contact was brief, warm, and completely without agenda. "Everyone here is afraid of you," she said gently. "But I don't think you're afraid of them. I think you're afraid of what happens when you stop being the monster everyone expects you to be." The truth of her words cut through him like a blade made of starlight. For years he had worn his reputation like armor, had fed the darkness inside him because it was easier than facing the loneliness that came with being untouchable. But here, with a small cat purring in his lap and a human who looked at him like he was worth saving, Vexstar 13 began to understand that there might be another way. "What if?" Emma asked, her voice soft but carrying the weight of revolution. "Instead of being the Academy's most feared weapon, you became its most devoted guardian?" 3 months later, the Academy had become a different place entirely. The change hadn't come through grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but through small, daily acts of unexpected gentleness. It began with Vexstar 13's transformation. From the monster in the corner to the guardian at the center of a quiet revolution. The mess hall buzzed with normal conversation now, the artificial silence of fear replaced by the organic noise of cadets from dozens of species sharing meals. And stories. At the same corner table where terror had once reigned, Vexstar 13 sat with Emma and an ever-growing circle of beings who had discovered that the Academy's most feared warrior was also its most protective friend. Muffin had become something of a celebrity, his presence serving as a bridge between species that had never imagined they could coexist peacefully. The small orange cat moved through the Academy like an ambassador of tranquility, equally at home in the lap of a chrome-plated Nexus unit or curled up against the warm scales of a Valorian warrior. His purr had become the Academy's unofficial anthem, a sound that reminded everyone that strength and gentleness were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of the same truth. Combat trial results are in, Emma announced, settling into her usual chair with a datapad in her hands. Around the table, cadets from 6 different species leaned in to listen. These were beings who had once crossed corridors to avoid Vexstar 13, now competing for the privilege of sharing his company. "Let me guess," said Zara, a young Valorian whose ritual combat scars had begun to fade as she discovered that honor could be earned through protection rather than domination. Vexstar 13 broke another record? The Draconian warrior looked up from where he was carefully feeding Muffin small pieces of synthesized fish. His golden eyes, once burning with rage, now held a warmth that made them seem almost gentle. 49 consecutive victories, he said with what might have been embarrassment. But I am trying to be more considerate of my opponents. Considerate? Laughed Chon 7, a Nexus unit whose programming had been fundamentally altered by exposure to feline companionship. Last week you spent 20 minutes teaching that Xanthari cadet how to improve his defensive stance after you defeated him. He had potential, Vexstar 13 replied, his massive frame somehow conveying sheepishness. And his technique was inefficient. It seemed wrong to leave him vulnerable. Emma smiled, remembering the reports she'd read about that particular trial. The Xanthari cadet had left the combat ring not in defeat, but in wonder, having received the first constructive advice of his military career from the being he had been taught to fear above all others. The instructors are calling it the Muffin effect, she said, scratching the cat behind his ears. Academic performance is up across all species. Disciplinary incidents have dropped by 70%, and request transfers to the Academy have increased by 300%. Because word has spread, said Tor, a massive Valorian whose species had been traditional enemies of the Draconians for millennia. They say the Academy has become a place where warriors learn to be heroes, instead of just soldiers. The transformation hadn't been without its challenges. There had been visitors from the Draconian High Command, officials who had come to investigate reports that their most successful berserker had gone soft. They had left confused but oddly hopeful, having witnessed Vexstar 13 demonstrate that true strength meant having the power to destroy, but choosing instead to protect. "There's something else," Emma said, her voice taking on the tone she used for important announcements. "The Academy Council has approved a new program. They're calling it the Companion Corps, a specialized unit that pairs warriors with Earth animals to help them discover their capacity for gentleness." She looked around the table at faces that had once been marked by fear and isolation, now bright with the possibility of a different kind of strength. They want Vexstar 13 to lead it. The silence that followed was nothing like the terrified hush that had once greeted the Draconian's presence. This was the silence of respect, of recognition, of beings who understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the galaxy's history. Vexstar 13 looked down at Muffin, who had finished his meal and was now engaged in the serious business of cleaning his paws. The cat's presence had taught him that the greatest victories weren't won through dominance, but through the daily choice to be gentle when you had the power to be otherwise. "The universe has spent so long teaching us to be afraid of each other," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Perhaps it is time we learn to be afraid of what we become when we stop caring for something smaller than ourselves." As if in response, Muffin looked up and began to purr, the sound carrying through the mess hall like a promise that even in the vast darkness of space, there was always room for a little gentleness. The Academy had found its new purpose, not just to train warriors, but to teach the galaxy that the strongest beings were those who chose to protect rather than dominate, to nurture rather than destroy. And at the center of it all, a 9-foot Draconian berserker and a small orange cat proved But the power of gentle chaos could indeed change the universe, one per at a time. Asterisk.